Hello, my name is Nick Deborah. I'm an independent educator and consultant in the fields of data visualization and dashboard design. And in this short video, I'm going to do a chart makeover. I'm going to take the chart on the left and turn it into the chart on the right. Now, I know at first glance, these don't look that different, but as I hope you'll see, there are some important changes that are actually going to make the chart on the right a lot easier to read. So let's have a closer look at the original chart. This is actually a chart that came from the software that I use to manage my email list. And if I leave it up for a moment, you can even pause the video if you like. You'll see that there are maybe some suboptimal issues around, particularly around the scales. So like I said, you can pause right now if you like and see how many of those you can spot before continuing to watch my improvements. All right, so I actually recreated this in Excel. It's not a perfect facsimile, but it's pretty close. And so we can start talking about ways to improve it. And so probably the first thing that I would point out is that the intervals on the scale on the side here are not great, right? If you look closely, you see that they actually go up by increments of 90. And it's not great because if I want to, for example, see, okay, well, what was this value? Okay, well, it's about halfway between 1,170 and 1,260. I mean, I could do that math, but it would probably be a lot easier if they were kind of more round numbers, essentially, in this scale. And so that's one of the things that I talk about in my practical charts course. There are lots of things to learn about quantitative scales, as you can see here, but one of them is that it's generally a good idea to choose intervals that are based on 1, 2, or 5. We find it easier to do those kind of mental calculations of kind of, sort of interpolating between two numbers based on numbers that are based on 1, 2, or 5. And unfortunately, this chart has a scale that's based on 9, all right, not 1, 2, or 5. And so if we base it on an interval based on 1, in this case, 100, then if I want to know, for example, okay, well, what is this value? It's about halfway between 1,100 and 1,200. It's 1,150, right? It's just a lot easier to do that math. Now let's look at the time scale down here. Not terribly intuitive. Even if I just want to know, okay, like how much time does this represent? Is this like 4 weeks, 4 months, 4 years? Okay, well, I got to kind of look at the beginning date and then compare that to the end date, figure out how much time has elapsed. If I want to find out when any of these points actually occurred, okay, well, so this one occurred about here, then I have to compare this date to this date, basically doing a lot of mental calculations. Again, I talk about timescales in my practical charts course, and one of the things that we talk about is the fact that most of the time it's good to use what I call a multi-level timescale. And so if we were to apply that to this chart, we go from a timescale it's not very intuitive to something like this, right? And so here we have months over years. And so now I can very quickly see that, yeah, this represents about 6 months. When did this value occur? In the middle of May, right? I didn't have to do any mental calculations in order to get to that point. The font size is a little bit hard to read, so I might just bump that up a little bit just to make it more legible. Or for people who have mild visual impairments, right? This is kind of a big deal. You don't want to make fonts that are too small in your charts. And there are also grid lines in this chart, although they might be a little bit hard to see because they're barely visible. Now, for things like grid lines and other sort of non-data elements, generally you want them to be pretty kind of toned down. But I think these are a little bit too toned down. I might bring them up a little, make them a little thicker, a little darker, just so that people can actually see them. Again, especially for people who might have visual impairments, even very mild visual impairments, they're just not going to see them at all if they're that light. Now, certainly to my eye, the fact that there's kind of a fill color underneath this line really makes it look like this, for example, this part of the chart is about 4 times as much as this, right? Because it really draws my attention between the distance between the line and, the bottom of the chart. But if you look at the numbers here, you can tell that actually, no, this is definitely not 1/4 of this, right? This is about 1,100, this is about 1,300. So yeah, this is kind of potentially maybe even a little bit misleading. And so I would remove the fill color here. There still is a risk, though, that if somebody's not paying attention, they might think that, oh, this is actually 1/4 of this. And so this kind of raises the question, should we perhaps start the scale of this chart at 0? This is actually quite a complicated question. I have entire articles written about this, but let's try it. Let's see what happens. Okay, so now we're starting our scale from 0, and we can see that actually, yeah, the overall pattern of change was not maybe as dramatic as it looked in the original chart. I can maybe kind of understand why my email management software would make it look, or would want to make it look like my subscriber count is shooting through the roof, but actually, it's been increasing, but not very dramatically. And it's also kind of harder to see small changes, right? If I wanted to see like, what were the actually, the individual increments during times like this, it's a little bit tough to see. And so is there a way where we could maybe show this sort of big picture, right? That there has been only kind of a sort of a modest increase, but still see those smaller changes? There is. We can use one of my favorite data visualization tricks, which I also talk about in my practical charts course, called inset charts. And so here with an inset chart, you can basically see kind of the small details when you have these values that are all sort of, tightly clustered within a narrow range, but you also see the big picture. And so if we were to apply this technique to a chart like this, we would end up with something like this. And so now we kind of have the best of both worlds, right? I can see those small details and changes up here, but I still always see the big picture, which is that overall, there was not a super dramatic change during this time. Now, depending on the software you're using, depending on the application, this may or may not be something that is doable. But even if we go back to that, stage just before we tried the inset chart, I still think that we're in a lot better shape compared to the original chart. One sort of minor thing that I might kind of notice here is that the line is just kind of very thin, right? And so it doesn't really kind of pop out maybe as much as it should, right? Because the line is the important thing in this chart. It's not the grid lines, it's not the scales, it's the line. And so we might want to highlight it in some way. And of course, I talked about that as well in my practical charts course. One of the options that we can use for highlighting, particularly in line charts, is to play around with line thickness. And so if I go back to my original chart, maybe I just thicken it up. And so now really it's kind of popping more, right? The most important thing in the chart, which is the line, is just now more kind of salient. It stands out more against the background. And so if we compare what I ended up with the original chart, well, it might have looked okay at first, but as I hope I've demonstrated, it was, it had maybe a higher risk of misinterpretation. It made the change look more dramatic than it actually was. The values themselves were hard to estimate because it had that weird kind of interval scale where the jumps were 90 instead of a more kind of round number. That time scale, as we saw, was just kind of hard to interpret. Lots of cognitive effort there. And those small fonts were just going to make it hard to read, especially for people who might have visual impairments. And so my redesign, even though at first glance doesn't look that different, actually is a much more kind of friendly or usable chart. The change looks more realistic because I don't have that fill color underneath the line, and the scale kind of makes a little bit more sense. The values are easier to visually estimate because I have better intervals, or intervals that are based on 1, 2, or 5. In this case, they're based on 1. They're intervals of 100. Timescale is just a lot easier to interpret, as we saw, and the fonts are large enough to read easily. Some relatively simple changes that actually make this chart, like I said, a lot more useful, a lot more usable. I mentioned my practical charts course a couple of times during this video. There is now an on-demand version of it. It's relatively new. If you'd like to take it, it is 6.5 hours of video and 45 lessons. And if you use the coupon code SAVE20-44, you can save 20% on the fee for that course. If you'd like more information, you can just go to my website, practicalreporting.com /PCOD, Practical Charts on Demand. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you disagree with any of the changes that I recommended, any of the improvements that I made to that chart, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.